We are just delighted that you are here this morning, and I'm really excited about this program, so I'm happy you're all here to experience it with me. My name is Elspeth Revere. I'm Vice President at the MacArthur Foundation in charge of media, culture, and special initiatives. I oversee our arts and culture grant making. I want to start with some thank yous. First to Jean de Saint Albin and her staff here. It's a wonderful place to have a program, and we really appreciate your hospitality. I also want to thank Jonas Cartano of EmcArts and our colleagues at MacArthur, Janet Janata and Erica Twyman, who helped put this program together for you all and make sure all the logistics worked. And a great big thank you especially to Deepa Gupta, Program Officer in Arts and Culture at the MacArthur Foundation, our one and only Arts and Culture Program Officer. Deepa, stand up, please. Deepa is always thinking about how to bring more resources to the arts community in Chicago, and this program is just one example of her being constantly on the alert to ways that we can stretch our grant making to make the arts sector here, which is so vital and wonderful, even more so. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. It's entitled The Real Work, New Practices for a New Era in the Arts. It's the latest in the series of public events that we've held in Chicago to foster discussion about topics that are timely and relevant, we hope, to all of you. We welcome your feedback all the time, anytime. We also welcome your ideas about other such events that might be helpful to you. It's my pleasure to be here with Richard Evans of EmcArts. He's going to talk about how current nonprofit arts organizations are adapting their operations and the development of their artistic work to remain viable and thriving in today's economic and cultural environment. This is a living topic for all of us who work in the arts, and I know you are all constantly challenged in the current cultural and especially economic environment to consider how to be innovative to achieve more operational sustainability and therefore invest more in the creation and delivery of your art. We hope you leave today with lots of ideas and energy to apply some of the concepts that Richard will talk to you about to your own situations as professionally run nonprofit arts organizations. So thank you all for being here. Let me just spend a minute introducing EmcArts and Richard. EmcArts was founded in 1999. Why am I wearing these glasses on my head? And is a social enterprise for learning and innovation in the arts. It serves as a nonprofit intermediary for many arts funders, including Rockefeller, Ford, Mellon, Irvine, and the Doris Duke Foundations. Richard Evans directs EmcArts programs and strategic partnerships. His recent research, program design, and facilitation places particular emphasis on innovation, organizational change, and effective ways that the arts and culture field can respond to the demands of a new era for the sector. Through EmcArts, he designs and leads several national and local programs focused on supporting arts organizations as they experiment with change in their organizations. Prior to founding EmcArts, he held numerous senior positions in performing arts management and philanthropy, including co-director of the National Endowment for the Arts Advancement Program, first coordinator of the National Alliance of Artist Communities, chief executive of the Bath International Festival of Music and Arts in England, and vice president of the National Arts Stabilization Fund. So please join me in welcoming Richard Evans.
Thank you so much, Elspeth, and thank you, Deepa, for all the work to have me and my colleagues be here today. It's great to be in balmy Chicago after the extraordinary weather we now get in the Northeast at this time of year, as you'll probably know. The Civilians is a small New York-based theatre company that for quite a while has been making site-specific theatre works. They go into a community and they'd work with people in that community to uncover and make theatre out of a hot topic in that community. They would then present the work they made from that to that community and take it on tour around the country. And the problem, the challenge they had to confront was that while they had a really close relationship with the citizens of that community while the work was being made, once they presented it and went on tour, they had no way to keep in contact with or maintain the involvement of those individuals in their work. So they looked at a way to use the web in a new way for them to create a new form of engagement. And they decided to prototype this with a new program called the Divorce Project. Great topic. And they went into various communities and asked people to talk about their parents' divorces. And from this, they made a play called You'd Better Sit Down. It's wrenching, but it's actually hilarious. And they presented this, but they also videoed the entire play and cut it up into like 10-minute webisodes. And they put those webisodes up on the web, and they invited everyone who'd been involved in the storytelling and others in those communities to comment on those segments of the play and to offer new stories or to embroider what they'd said before. And they then downloaded all that material and turned it into another version of the play, which they then took on tour, made webisodes of, put up on the web, and invited people to comment on. So they found a way through this iterative process to continue the engagement with the people who'd been the originators of their work. They then applied that to their next project, which was about climate change, called The Great Immensity, and got $750,000 from the National Science Foundation to support this new way of engaging people in topic-specific, social issue-based theatre. The Memphis Symphony Orchestra some years ago made a small but rather vital shift in its mission. Instead of talking about the great music that it would bring to Memphis, it changed its mission to say that it existed to create meaningful experiences through music for the citizens of Memphis. And this little shift, making music the means, not the end, opened up all sorts of doors in their own thinking and in the community. And then they went out to the community, instead of asking people where they could perform their great music, they began to ask them how they together could contribute to achieving community goals. And this really began to open up a lot of doorways, and one of the most important was with FedEx, based in Memphis, with which they'd had only a tangential relationship before. And they developed a program called Leading from Every Chair, which uses the symphony orchestra as a mechanism to teach leadership development to corporate managers. This was created entirely by the musicians of the Memphis Symphony Orchestra, working in conjunction with middle managers at FedEx. And it's now been successfully implemented not only at FedEx in Memphis, but at their branches all around the country, and indeed in other corporations around Memphis, entirely devised and performed by the musicians. And this is now becoming a major new revenue stream for the Memphis Symphony. The Music Center, or Performing Arts Center of Los Angeles County, you'll know primarily, I suspect, in relation to those big cultural palaces, the Mark Taper Forum, the Armanson Theater, and so on the hill next to Disney Hall in downtown Los Angeles. But around all these buildings are these incredible plazas that the Performing Arts Center simply wasn't using. So 6 years ago, it began a program called Active Arts. And Active Arts was a program which happens entirely outside the buildings. It's a participatory program. It began very small, with people being invited to come and dance on a Wednesday evening in the plaza. They laid down a dance floor, they put up some lights, they arranged some music, and you came along and you danced. They did different styles on different weeks. And gradually this began to expand. In fact, rather quickly, there were 600 people every Wednesday, and then twice a week, and then there were 1,000. And then they moved on to create a special orchestra for people who had once played an instrument but had let it grow rusty. They called it the Get Your Chops Back Orchestra. And on a Tuesday, they would come and rehearse and play together. They began storytelling circles. They even began a massive flute choir, which I think is the worst possible sound in the world. I say that as a reformed flute player, so don't worry. And the point about these events was there was no audience, right? You didn't come along to watch people dance, you came along to dance. You didn't come along to listen to people play, you came along to play. There was no audience. In fact, they had to work really hard to stop there being an audience, because some people would tend to stop and look at the really good dancers, and they say, no, you get back in there and do this. The whole thing was entirely participatory, and it sounds like a little extra for the Music Center. But then people got so keen on doing this that the Music Center started to charge registration fees, just $5 at first, to make sure you could get that place on the dance floor, that place in the orchestra. Now those fees are about $35 to $50 for each event or each season of events, and it's becoming a six-figure income stream for the Music Center. And the numbers are not going down, they're going up. And most interesting of all, right opposite the Music Center in Los Angeles is the city park owned by the county, which they decided to entirely redevelop. It's bulldozers all over it right now. And they said to the Music Centre, we'd like you to program the park when it's redeveloped. And they decided at the board level of the Music Centre that all the programming in the new city park would be active arts programming. So within 2 years, there will be millions of dollars coming in from the county to support what was once a scrappy little program of people dancing on a Wednesday night. I suspect in a few years this will be the signature program of the Music Centre in LA. So what is it that is causing these organizations and many others across the country to do things differently, to do things they've never done before? And how is it that organizations like these are being successful? What is it they've found out to help them be successful in innovating and moving in directions that they've never tried before? Those are some of the questions I'd like to try and address this morning. And as I do that, I'm going to throw a lot of material at you, a lot of ideas, a lot of pictures and charts. And you don't have to scribble madly, because we'll send around all the slides afterwards, so don't worry about that. The modern era, I think, for the professional performing arts and visual arts organizations of our country began in the 50s. And I think we're at the end of that first phase of development. It's often called the Ford era in the arts, at least the first 30 years of it, because of the enormous influence of the Ford Foundation on the way in which professional arts organizations developed. The foundation put millions, tens of millions, in fact billions of dollars into the arts at today's prices to help create an infrastructure of organizations around the country. They weren't the only actor, of course, but they had a huge influence, and in a way that's not, I think, inappropriate to the early stages of building a professional infrastructure. The ideal or the type of organization that came into being, the kind of structures that came into being, were entirely, I think, structured for growth. And that's the phrase I'd use to describe this first phase of arts development. Growth in finances, growth in audiences, growth in programs were the principal measures of success used to signify development in the field, not just by our leaders and practitioners, but by funders as well. And so over time, under the influence of Ford and others, there came to be a kind of homogeneous model, a kind of set of norms in the field, if you like, that I think we often take for granted. It was Ford that brought in Danny Newman to begin thinking about subscription selling in theatre and then in the orchestra field. It was because Ford gave largely matching gifts at that time that the annual development campaign came in existence to meet those matches. And indeed, the role of trustees as fundraisers was really cemented by the large capital as well as operating support matching grants that Ford gave. And as time developed, it became more and more important, it seemed, to build capital endowment funds to help organizations have a reliable stream of income that would ensure that the expansion could continue as these organizations grew. Everything was geared to that sense of growth and expansion. This may seem like ancient history, or you may feel it really only relates to big organizations, but I think the influence that Ford and a few others had, first on the NEA in the 60s, then on state and local arts councils, and then on countless regional and a few national private funders of the arts, meant that actually the legacy of that era was a very long one. It's only just now, I think, really beginning to depart, because I think that era is at an end. Even though we disguise the erosion of our business model, I think, by all sorts of coping mechanisms to make it look as though we can still continue, in truth, I think we are entering a new era for the arts. And that new era will not be one in which we are all built and organized for growth, but rather for what I call adaptability. This is caused, I think, by the enormous changes that we're seeing in the world around us. This is generational and demographic change, but it's also changes in technology, of course, the massive new ways in which people engage with the arts that go beyond the live performance and are now attracting so many people. It also has to do with differences in the way people make their choices about the arts. They're not so inclined now to commit 6 to 9 months in advance and do a subscription season. They want to make their minds up at the last minute. They want to sample much more than they want to be loyal to a single organization. And you'll all know of other changes which you experience every day, which are causing us to question the very bases on which our arts organizations, I think, have been built. And we're finding that business as usual is simply not producing the returns which it did even 10, perhaps even 5 years ago. There is this massive tsunami of creative potential and organizational disruption, which I think is rippling its way through the sector, beginning of 6 or 7 years ago. And this means that our organizations have to change in quite fundamental ways, I think, if they're going to be successful in the future. They need to develop high levels, this is bound to work really, there we go, high levels of adaptive capacity. Instead of continuing to grow their business as usual inexorably over time, they have to learn how to adapt to new circumstances and the kind of constantly changing environment in which we now find ourselves. That means they have to engage also with more of the creative potential in our communities. Those of you who follow the NEA studies of public participation will know that the most recent demonstrated that just about 3/4 of American citizens say they engage in the arts and that the arts is important to them in their lives, but less than 1/3 of those say they have anything to do with the professional arts sector. So there is a huge amount of avocational work out there and creative interest and experience that is not tapped into by our professional arts organizations. Many of them are beginning to make the bridge to that enormous territory of creative interest. This means, of course, much more open structures. It means much more engagement with the community, much lower boundaries, looser boundaries to our organizations, and much more nimble structures that allow us to respond rather than become stuck in a particular way of doing business. And it means that the role of our cultural professionals is changing. Samuel Jones of Demos in London, the cultural researcher, recently wrote that the role of the cultural professional is changing from a model of provision to one of enabling. A very different kind of role. So if we're called upon, I think, to develop new adaptive capacities, we might look at things in a different way. Another way of saying this would be to say that we used to think there was really one set of critical organizational qualities, all of which had to do with what I'll call organizational stability over time. As our organizations grew and as the sector grew, stability was the thing to maintain as these great sunflowers on their very long stalks continued to bloom and blossom. And we got very good at creating capacities in our organizations which would support organizational stability. Here are a few of them. We had hierarchical technical departments. We had command and control cultures, all of which keep us on the rails of business as usual and make sure we just don't fall off one side or the other. These are really important protective devices and ways to ensure we're efficient as we go forward in this work. We developed fixed assets and endowments, and we did strategic planning that was rationally projecting the future to be somewhat rather like the past. And indeed, in circumstances where the future was likely to be similar to the past, only more so, this was a pretty good strategy. But what we've discovered in recent years, in fact, there's a whole other axis to this graph, which is the axis of what I'll call adaptive capacity. A whole set of muscles that organizations need to develop if they are to gain the flexibility that's required in these times, and if they are to be good at doing things differently, not just wandering around in the dark making lots of mistakes. And in fact, what it seems like now is that the path to long-term public value in our work lies in balancing these two fundamental organizational qualities. That's not to say that all the work we've done on organizational stability has to be thrown away, but rather that it now has to be balanced with a whole other set of organizational muscles that are relatively underdeveloped in our sector. And it's only if we can do so that we're going to find we can sustain the public value of our work. I'd slightly change that arrow, actually, because in an individual organization's trajectory over time, I think it's more like this. Organizations, when they're young or when they're smaller, tend to be highly adaptive. They don't have much infrastructure, they're not very stable, they grow more stable into that middle area, and they really pursue stability as the way of the future. And a lot of them get stuck somewhere around here, or they think the next stage is up here. And what we're finding now is that actually the path to increased public value lies by increasing the adaptability of the organization. Now you show someone like me a couple of axes like that, and you can be damn sure I'm going to break it up into quadrants and things like that. So here it is. I couldn't resist it. I'd like to say, well, what's it like if it's high and high or low and low? And this is at least one way that it might look. And the top right-hand quadrant there, you've got organizations, if you like, that are highly adaptive, but also relatively stable. They've managed to be financially and organizationally stable, while at the same time developing their capacity to change, and change effectively with new circumstances. We call them the new leaders in the arts field. And we've worked with over 100 organizations in the past few years, and I will tell you that there is no predictor of the size of those organizations, of the art form, of the location, of the longevity. This is a whole new set of organizations of many sizes that is showing themselves capable of having both sides of this equation in spades. At the other side, of course, in the lower left quadrant, are the organizations that are struggling on both dimensions. They are relatively unstable and they're really struggling to change what they do. These are organizations I think we're often very sentimental about. You know, we often find ourselves saying, oh, they used to do such great work. Do you remember that show a couple of years ago? It was great. You can always remember things in the past. You can never quite remember things right now. And we really want them to go on. But the truth of the matter is, unless those organizations make a move in one direction or the other, unless they become more stable or more adaptive, there's actually very little we can do for them. They're not able to achieve public value. And funders of the arts, I think, often put, disreputable amounts of money into trying to save these organizations, when in fact there's very little that can be done unless they make a first move. But most of our organizations are in one of the other two quadrants, I think. They're either in the upper left quadrant. There's a lot of organizations in our field, I think, that are actually relatively stable, but are really struggling to change and meet the challenges of the new era that we're entering. They find business as usual something they've really got in their skin. They do it really well. But when it comes to change, when it comes to purposeful new activities, new fundamental approaches, they're very hesitant. Their cultures tend to make those marginal rather than central. A lot of orchestras, I think, are in that quadrant. And we're seeing all around the country right now another swathe of orchestras really struggling to find what it means to adapt to the new circumstances. On the lower right quadrant, we have organizations that are relatively adaptive, but have not become so stable, who really need to gain stability to move up to the top right. A lot of dance companies, never having had the kind of largesse thrown at them that orchestras have, remain in this bottom right-hand quadrant. And the question may be for you, where's your organization across these four quadrants, and what's your own trajectory if you try to move towards that upper right-hand quadrant? One of the things that's really important, I think, if we're going to become more adaptive and respond to the challenges that this new era gives us, is to distinguish between those types of challenges that we face. And we follow the great Harvard scholar Ronald Heifetz, leader of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, who makes a distinction between technical and adaptive challenges, which I think you'll find familiar. Technical challenges, he suggests, are those that can be solved by extending and improving what we currently do. They don't require breakthrough change. They don't require that we start afresh or take a wholly new direction. We need to improve our performance in terms of our current strategies. And this is the bread and butter of what we do every day. This is really what it's all about. We're always keen to improve our marketing, get a better return on the dollar, to make our development campaign stronger, to improve our operations in the hall. All these things we do, and rightly, because they're the ways we can get better at what we do and become more efficient. Sometimes we'll ask a consultant what the options are, and they will draw up maybe 3 or 4 options, and we'll pick one and we'll improve, because there are known solutions out there in the world. But now I think we're addressing a lot more adaptive challenges. And by these, Heifetz refers to those that have no established solution. There's no consultant you can go to and say, what are our options? Which one should we do here? You have to find your own solution. These are the kinds of challenges that require you to change your belief system, to change your assumptions, and to find your own way forward that's unique to your organization. That means that there's no external agency that can solve these problems for you. You've got to find it inside your organization. That usually means people coming together in new ways to address this kind of challenge. So one of the first questions might be, how do you tell the difference between these two challenges? And Heifetz has a quite nice quote, I think, about that. He says, or sometimes he says, here he is, flying in from the left. If you throw all the technical fixes you can at the problem and the problem persists, it's pretty clear that there's some underlying adaptive challenge that has yet to be met. So I think one of the ways to begin to identify these challenges is to think about persistence. What are those niggly, persistent things that won't go away? We thought we'd solved it, you know? I thought the box office blip last year was a one-year phenomenon, and we changed a few things, and we thought we'd got it, but actually, now I'm looking at the returns, it's looking like there's more to it than that. Or I really thought that by increasing the healthcare benefits and giving those extra 2 days of vacation, we would stop the turnover of staff, or at least really slow it down, you know. But now we've had 3 people leave in the last 2 months. It's just not going away. There's something persistent that clearly means we haven't quite got it yet. Those tend to be adaptive challenges that require you to change your assumptions and think differently about the way you approach things. So some of the questions you might ask yourselves about these 2 different types of challenge are, you know, what are the challenges we're facing that we can solve them via gradual improvement? And if that's the right question, or if you can identify some, then you say to yourselves, who can we access to give us the technical advice that we need? But on the adaptive side, you might say, what challenges do we face that have persisted, despite us trying lots of different strategies to address them? And where there's no expert we can turn to. In which case, the question is going to be more like, how can we bring people together in a new way to begin to address this challenge? And I'll talk more about bringing people together in new ways in a short while. If we're going to do this, if we're called upon to address these adaptive challenges, we need to build our adaptive capacity. Let's be clear what it is. It's not a term that's used so very much in the arts right now. Here's our colleague John McGurk at the Hewlett Foundation's attempt at this. He calls it an organization's ability to initiate and implement productive and purposeful change in response to shifts in the operating environment. Notice, not only initiate, it's not only about starting things, it's also about implementing them and seeing them through. It's about execution as much as it's about ideas. And it's not just about change for change's sake, it's about purposeful change that has a relationship to your mission that can achieve public value. This is not just novelty for its own sake. So adaptive capacity is the muscles, the procedures and systems that you put in place in your organizations that enable you to do this work. And which, as I say, I think are underdeveloped because we spent so much of our time looking at technical changes and looking at our technical capacities in the past. If we're going to do this, the first thing I think we have to do, and I've been banging on about it, is question our assumptions. Every organization has a set of assumptions which drive its behavior. It's really important that they do, because it actually helps them to keep on the rails. It also limits their capacity for change. When you start an organization, you have a hunch, you have a hypothesis about what will work, and you try it. And some of these turn out to be correct or successful. So you go on doing them. And as you do them, they kind of sink down inside the organization until they fall out of sight, because they become the assumptions on which you build the business. You might say, if we put together a band of really good musicians, that will attract an audience that will pay at least this much. And you try it, and indeed it's true. And as you improve the quality of the musicians, let's say, or of the dancers, so the audience grows and they pay more to come and hear or see them. That original hunch turned out as a hypothesis to be a good predictor of success. And so it became gradually an assumption. Another great writer on this subject is Edgar Schein at MIT. He actually invented the phrase corporate culture, and he writes about assumptions in this way. He says, assumptions evolve as repeated successful solutions to problems. What was once a questionable hypothesis about how to proceed becomes a reality that's taken for granted. This is really important, I think, because these things, as I say, do sink down out of sight, and we think they're realities. Often when people question us about them, we get a bit upset. What do you mean the quality of our ensemble is a barrier to some people for performance? Or what do you mean our beautiful shiny building is not perhaps the best place to do all our programs? You know, there are underlying assumptions we carry around with us which we take to heart, and we don't like to see them disturbed. But the trouble is, as Schein goes on to say, is that that's the very thing we have to do. He says, in order to innovate, organizations have to resurrect, examine, and break the frame created by old assumptions. His language of violence, even, I think is appropriate. This is difficult work, and it's work which requires you to really break some of the habitual ways of thinking, which will defend to the hilt in more regular, more stable times. So this work of resurrecting, looking again, treating them as if again they were questionable hypotheses, and then breaking the frame, the mental mindsets which are created by these deep assumptions, is the first step in moving us towards being able to do things differently that are purposeful and innovative. If that's the case, then we're moving towards innovation by shifting these underlying assumptions. Some of the questions you might ask yourselves: what are the underlying assumptions that we're beginning to question? These are the things that keep you awake at night. because you sense that the evidence is such that that assumption may not hold anymore. You need to be clear on the evidence. What is this contradictory evidence that we should be considering? Not just anecdote, not just blaming somebody else for the fact something didn't work, but actual hard data, trends that suggest that the assumption we're building a part of our business on no longer holds. And then you might say, if we were to build our future on a new hypothesis, what might it be? What assumption might we try that better fits that evidence and might be a better platform for us to build new strategies on? What can we test out to see if that's the case? All of this leads us towards what we call organizational innovation. And when we started this work, we looked around for some definitions of that phrase, because it's a slippery one. Everyone says innovation, what does that mean? It could mean all sorts of things. And we found lots and lots in the for-profit field, but very few in the not-for-profit field, or ones that applied to the arts. So we made one up. That seemed the best way to go, really. This is not a litmus test. It's just a three-part definition that sets some standards and helps create a conversation, I think, around what distinguishes innovation from regular incremental change. And there you'll see the first piece, that innovations are based upon some shift in the underlying assumptions of your organization. An example of that might be community schools of the arts, which I've had the pleasure of working with for 20 years and more. A long time ago, you'd go to a community school of the arts, and it would be full from about 3:30 through the evening and at weekends, but it would be empty during the working week, because the assumption was that that's where the market was. The market was after school, with kids being excuse me, brought by their parents, and at the weekend when everyone was out of school. But gradually, a few leaders of the field began to question that assumption and realized that there were other populations, special populations, that actually could be available. There could be homeschoolers, there were seniors, there were people on different shifts. There are a number of special populations that were available throughout the school day, throughout the working day. So they began to hire more teachers and develop new marketing towards those different populations. And now, if you go into a community school, you'll usually find them just as full and thriving during the working day as they are at the weekends and in the evenings. A shift in assumptions led to an entirely new market and a quite new business model for those generally thriving institutions around the country. The second part is that innovations are discontinuous from previous practice. That means they are not extensions of business as usual. They are moving into a new element, stepping off what you've done in the past. It's quite sort of rational and incremental to change your ticket prices, for instance, to reflect economic times and what you learn about your audiences. But to shift from doing your work in one large venue to do it in a number of community venues at lower price for more people is the kind of discontinuous thinking that leads to innovation, which is what the Sacramento Ballet did just a couple of years ago, to net revenue gains. And the third piece is that innovations provide new pathways to public value. You see, the thing is, you could do the first two. You could have something which derives from a shift in assumptions and is unlike anything you've ever done, but it could be just novelty for its own sake. It's really important that innovations have real public purpose, that they serve your mission. And they are particularly good new pathways to delivering public value because they take a lot of effort, they involve risk, sometimes less risk than doing nothing, but still a lot of risk and a lot of time and effort. So they need to be powerful pathways to achieve public value. Letting teens decide the nature of teen arts programs, which is happening a lot around the country now, would have been unthinkable some years ago. Letting audience members have some kind of say in the work that's presented to them would have seemed heretical years ago. And yet both of these are ways, in fact, that people are finding they can build public value through their work. So those are our three parts of the definition of innovation. One of the things we're learning as we move from these theories into practice is that innovation is about making connections in new ways. It's about connecting things which previously have been kept apart. You may know the writing of Stephen Johnson, writes a lot on innovation. And he has a nice term for this. He talks about the adjacent possible. And what he means by that, he has an image. He says you go into a house and there's one room and there are three other doors out of that room. And you go through one of the doors, and as you go through it, another room opens up with three more doors in it. And you go through one of those doors and another room opens up. And eventually, if you pick the right doors, you find yourself a long way away from where you came in. But it's been step at a time. And these doorways have opened to you as you've explored alternative pathways. The new connections we're seeing organizations make happen, I think, over three different dimensions. if we're lucky. First of all, we're seeing new connections made within our organizations. Yes, we are lucky. Within our organizations. And secondly, we're seeing new connections between organizations. And thirdly, and most importantly in the end, of course, new connections with our communities. But I would say we're finding that you can't do the last of those, the most important, if you don't do the others, if you don't do the first two. So new ways of connecting the people who make up our organizations is critical, as is working in new ways with other organizations. And we're seeing a lot of new practices in this regard. I'll mention here just a couple and come back to some more. Inside our organizations, we're seeing a lot of the old barriers which have existed between our departments. We often talk of ourselves as rather siloed in that way, dissolving as people come together in new kinds of teams that are cross-functional and cross-departmental. And we're seeing artists used in new ways inside our organizations. It's always been a great cause for sorrow for me in many ways that a lot of organizations in our field have, I would say, sequestered our creative assets to be only about production and creation, and have kept them out of the business of organizational problem solving. And yet, when it comes to adaptive change, where you need creative thinking, we have in our midst some of the most creative lateral thinkers in the world. So using artists not as representatives of the program point of view, but as fully vested organizational members solving the big strategic issues is a new way, I think, that those assets can be brought to bear inside our organizations. And then between organizations, we're seeing a lot more collaboration at a new level. Indeed, mergers. We just completed the merger of the Bill T. Jones Dance Company with Dance Theatre Workshop in New York, which you may have read about. An unusual and rather groundbreaking merger for the dance field. A single choreographer company looking to find its legacy with a dance presenter and educator that had space would be a recipe for dynamite if you try to bring them together traditionally. But in fact, they found the right synergy between their missions to create New York Live Arts, which launched its first season in September. And we're seeing that more important than differentiating my company from yours now is building critical mass by working together. We're in an age, I think, where the arts are in danger of being largely irrelevant to many people's lives, at least the professional arts. And we're finding that differentiation is less important than building critical mass by joint action together. And then with our communities, I think new gateways to participation, new ways for people to participate in the arts is a key part of the innovations we're seeing in the field. And moving from the idea of marketing, of sales to passive consumers, to actually engaging people around different forms of participation in the process as well as the product of art. These are some of the really key kinds of connections that are being created. As a result of that, we're seeing shifts in the way that organizations function. And I'd like to share just a few of those with you. Organizations in our field are, of course, 8-pointed stars filled out with beautifully embossed wood and precious metals and stones, of course. They're 8-pointed stars because I have 8 things to say. And I'm sure you could find 8 others that would be at least as relevant to your companies. But here are ones where we're seeing a lot of change in the way that arts organizations function. And I'd like to briefly suggest to you some of the old features we've seen and some of the emerging new ones that I think typify the more adaptive approach that arts organizations are now taking. In terms of mission, I think most arts organizations used to write up their mission in terms of what they were going to do and how wonderful they were going to be at doing it. Organizational outputs and achievements were the focus of the mission statement. It was a supply-side way of thinking. Now we're seeing a lot of organizations shift their mission or restate their mission to focus much more on the community impact that they're going to have and the value they're going to have to those who participate in their programs. A bit like Memphis did in shifting its mission statement. In terms of how we make artistic choices and what artistic direction our companies move in, we've always seen this in the past, I think, as the province essentially of one or a very small number of artistic leaders or curators who make the decisions, a set of insiders who handle the singular direction in which we will move. We're seeing this now, shouldn't have done that. We're seeing this now, I'm going to go back one, excuse me. There we are. Not handing over that sense of artistic direction to the participants in our programs, which I think is the caricature we often hear about. Oh, let's not ask the audience what they want. That would be dreadful. And it probably would. This is about engaging in a dialogue. It's about opening up the space around creativity and artistic direction so that it's a dialogue with external voices. And we're seeing a lot more of that happen in both the visual and the performing arts. And then the kinds of artistic groups we put together, the musicians, the dancers, and so on. The traditional approach was always that this was highly selective, that we extracted the most talented performers from our communities, and then we presented them back to those communities at as high a cost as we could in formal seasons of activity. I say that the previous era for the arts was based essentially on the concept of excellence and scarcity. That was the value proposition. I think we're moving now towards one which is based much more on what I would call abundance and intimacy. And that means a very different relationship with the creativity in our communities. And we're seeing professional artists not go away, of course, but their job is changing. A lot more of their work is with others in the community, helping enable creative expression, expressive lives in our communities, rather than merely being presented at formal events where you sit in rows like this and listen or watch. When it comes to organizational boundaries, I think there's a shift there too. Again, the norm in the past was that we have strong boundaries, we differentiate ourselves from the other theatre company, the other dance company, let alone from other non-profits, so we can establish a unique identity. What we're seeing now, I think, is much more porous boundaries, much more openness to the community, and as I said, an interest in building critical mass by discovering commonalities rather than differences. In terms of our administrations and our staffing, we developed in the first phase in the arts, I think, very hierarchical departments as we grew, even if they were departments of one. And we focused on technical specialties. We separated out marketing and development and governance and operations and programming and so on. The problem with this approach, while it was technically and in terms of stability very advantageous, was we created an awful lot of boring jobs. Created so many boring jobs. If you're the third person down in the development department and you're putting in the data every day, you really don't feel like you're very close to the artistic juice, right? If you're used to proof the printed materials in marketing or now the web materials, you don't really feel like you're close to the artistic director or to having responsibility for the product on the stage. So we have a lot of turnover in those positions. We pay low wages just to complete the picture so that we get a lot of unmotivated people paid low wages who of course move on. And turnover is a huge problem, and the new generation coming into our field, or thinking about coming into our field, have made it very clear that they're not interested in those kind of jobs. So we're talking now about what some people call post-specialist workers, people who are multi-talented, who bring their whole selves to their job, not just the bit that fits the title or the label. And they're working in new kinds of teams in which everybody has some direct responsibility for making sure the show hits the road and that the art is moved forward. This motivates, it makes everybody feel central, but it really challenges that question of technical specialties that we've depended upon in the past. In terms of marketing, as I've already mentioned, I think we've developed some extremely effective ways to sell our products to essentially passive consumers, and we have pushed the ticket prices as hard as we can to keep that revenue up to 50% or higher if we can. We're beginning to price ourselves out of the market in many cases. The returns are becoming much lower for much higher marginal marketing costs in many cases. And we're finding that people don't want to just turn up and buy their piece of paper and sit in a row at 8 p.m. They want to be engaged, and they want to be engaged before and after. I worked with one company recently in New York that was trying to answer the question, when does the show begin? And the answer was not Tuesday at 8 o'clock. It was about 6 months in advance. And it went on about 4 months afterwards because they needed to have a system of engaging their patrons long before they actually came along to the performance, in the journey of the artist, in the process of creating the work, as much as in the final product. So I often say that marketing directors are becoming engagement managers, is the new paradigm, if you like. In terms of governance, I think partly under the influence of those that were doing all these matching grants and the things I was saying at the beginning, we developed large boards that were stacked with our core funders and whose main job was to solicit support for our existing work. The difficulty with this is that these large boards aren't very good at governance. Too many people who are there because they gave money who aren't necessarily good at making decisions about how non-profits get run, left us with, to me, the biggest problem in the field. The change in governance, I think, is going to be huge if we're going to survive and thrive in this new era for the arts. And we're beginning to see boards getting smaller. Not just that executive committee, which was created because our board is 60 people and they can't govern, but now the rest of them feel like they're not really very involved. We're getting much smaller boards. The board of the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts that we're working with is now 7 people. And they really govern it. And they're ambassadors for new work and for change in the community. They're not all the donors. Donors no longer get put on the board in the same way, and it's a real problem that they are. How many people have I spoken to, or politicians who say, but the arts are only for the wealthy? We know that because look at your boards. You know, it's too easy a stick to beat us with. So governance is changing, and will change a lot more, I think. And our financial profiles, I think, are also changing. As Elspeth was saying, I was once vice president at the National Arts Stabilization Fund, so I know this stuff from the inside. And I bought in pretty heavily to the notion that you build long-term capital assets to enable your permanence, and permanence is what it was all about. We focused on getting that building. You're not grown up until you've got the building. You're not really grown up unless you've got an endowment. That's all changing, I think. And any of you that's thinking about an endowment campaign or a new building, I'd say stop. Because you become much less flexible. You don't have to have studied the Nonprofit Finance Fund in detail to know how much they've shown us about how the building of permanent assets slows down organizations, makes them less flexible, leaves them servicing those fixed assets instead of servicing their programs or their communities. The focus now is much more on retaining liquidity and on creating available liquid reserves that can be used as risk capital. There's been very little risk capital in our field until recently. The Doris Duke Foundation is one that is beginning to do that. Irvine is another. Beginning to recognize that if organizations are going to innovate, they need to have capital funds to underwrite those critical first few years in which an innovation probably won't and shouldn't pay its way out of contributions and revenues. So risk capital is beginning to come into the field, and the profile of organizations financially is beginning to change. This is long-term, slow and controversial work. Those are some of the structural changes that we're seeing. I'm sure, as I say, you could think of your own. But ask yourselves, in terms of these, you know, where in our organization is there pressure and urgency to move from the old to the new? And what barriers are we experiencing as we do that? And what do we need to do then to overcome those barriers and move towards these emerging features? These are some of the important discussions we're seeing organizations have about how they connect in a new way inside their organizations. Let me just give you some examples of organizations that, in doing things new and differently, have found them changing the way they do business. I mentioned the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco. I'm sure you know it's a major contemporary presenter and art gallery. It was troubled by the fact that in a city famous for its diversity and its youth culture, it was getting largely white people in their 50s and 60s, the traditional audience, despite the content of their programs. And they addressed this with what they call the immersive visitor experience. And one of the things they did early on was to change the times at which their galleries are open. They're now open from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. because that's when young people are out and about. That's when they're actually looking to do stuff. And they gave up with that, the notion that their staff would ever work anything like regular hours. They changed the times of their performances as well. But most important, perhaps, they handed over a lot of the curatorial and artistic decisions to the young junior staff members, highly creative, but with hardly a voice inside the organization, who represented the demographic that they were trying to attract. And they discovered remarkable imagination and curatorial vision among these groups of people who previously had been voiceless inside the organization. Ken Foster, the executive director, should be given a lot of credit for that kind of ceding of territory to people who would not normally have the opportunity. And it's transformed the way the organization functions and the kind of audience that they now have. MAP International Productions in New York was the organization trying to answer the question, when does the show begin? And having decided it began 6 months in advance, they create new multimedia contemporary work with artists working in different disciplines. And they commission the work, they help them with the creation of it, and then they present it and tour it. It's the full package. And they realized that if they were going to grow the level of interest in the work of these artists and the work of MAP as the producer, they had to engage them long in advance, and they had to use everything at their disposal, including the web, to do so. So they create a whole new program, which, as the artist creates the work, involves the artist in an ongoing dialogue with patrons about what's going on, their journals, rehearsal footage, blogs about what they're doing, even questions to the world at large to help me research the work that I'm creating. And they allowed the patrons to engage in this cycle of dialogue as much or as little as they wanted to. And they could be rewarded for whatever they gave towards the production by having more and more access to the artists. They called it the Cultural Investor Program, and they combined it with real-life activities along the way in which you can meet the artists, see the work as it progresses, and so on. It's like their own kind of Kickstarter in a way. And the big change inside their organization was that their artists had to learn to work in a very different way, had to learn to open up their creative processes to being talked about with people they might never have met. So it changed the whole way in which artists work. And in fact, they now train their artists to work in this particular way. At the De Young Museum in San Francisco, since it was rebuilt in the beautiful new building in Golden Gate Park, is, of course, an encyclopedic museum with wonderful holdings and great blockbuster shows on a regular basis, but not much relationship with the artistic community of San Francisco. So they developed a program called Cultural Encounters. It really began under the radar in their public performances, public programs arena. And they started to do these Friday nights. They're not unusual. Friday nights is a big thing at lots of museums. They brought in performing artists from around the Bay Area to do performances. They created family events. They did lectures in their auditorium. And they gradually began to fill the museum every Friday night. They now do this 47 Fridays every year. And they have 5,000 to 6,000 people coming out to the museum. It's one of the places you go on a Friday night now. But that was just the beginning. They now created artists in residence, and they have a wonderful program of fellowships in which artist collectives in the Bay Area, small collectives of artists working together, get the opportunity to be in residence for 6 months at the museum and make work in the museum and be shown there. And the museum takes works out to be shown at those collectives venues as well. So they found a way to become much more porous to the community. And you can imagine what it was like when they started setting up the speakers for the jazz concert with all the chairs just outside the galleries, and the people spilled over into the galleries. The curators, whew, they were completely mad that you can't do that. You can't do that. You can't do that at all. Keep out of my spaces. And they started holding events inside the galleries. There was a massive but quiet battle for who owned the turf and how are we going to operate. So they really had to think about operating in a different way and collaborating inside the organization in completely new ways. They did this as well at another museum whose program I love, the Hammer Museum, part of UCLA in Los Angeles. Wonderful collection of very contemporary work, but really it's in the Oxy Petroleum building, and it's like marble everywhere, white marble on a huge scale, and you feel really alone and empty when you go in there. So they wanted to try and animate the public spaces. So they created a new position called Senior Curator of Public Engagement. That's her title, Senior Curator of Public Engagement. She's part of the curatorial team. She's not lost in the education department, as so many are, unfortunately. She was given that title, and her job was to animate the spaces. The first thing she did was brought in an artist called Mark Allen, who runs a thing called the Machine Project. He has about 80 collaborators, and over a year they put on performances and events throughout the spaces. They created a concert series in the closet under the stairs for 2 people at a time. They called them the Little Richard concerts. And you can see one going on the left there. There's 2 performers, and there may be a small space, but you can see they've got their back projection going nicely there with the video. They did 80 of those in a year. They created a fungi festival where you could come along and rub noses with fungi. You could dress up as fungi. You could talk about fungi in painting. You could meet your favorite fungus. There were bigger scale things as well. They had a dream in for 100 people. They brought sleeping bags and they stayed overnight and then talked about their dreams. They had a ping pong festival for a month. Many of these things were bringing sound into the galleries, as places you often think of as dead quiet, where we shush people. They wanted to fill them with sound, and they do this now year-round, and it's meant working completely differently inside the organization. One of the other things that I'm finding those kinds of initiatives have in common, or many of those that we're working with, is that they're really thinking about how people participate, not just the serried ranks of people who've bought tickets, not just the gallery goer who stands and listens to the audio track, but new ways for people to engage. And I'm sure many of you know the work of Alan Brown, who's done a lot of mapping of the field around this question of participation, and I find it very provocative. Here's the basic diagram that Alan put together a few years ago, and what he suggests is that people engage in the arts in a variety of different ways. in which they have more or less creative control over that activity. And you can see his arrow at the left there, from no creative control up to total control over it. So at the level of no control at all, we have what he calls ambient participation. This is the music in the elevator, in the restaurant. This is the art show at the airport that you go past on the travelator. You haven't chosen to be next to it. It hasn't chosen to be with you. You just happen to hear it or see it. You have no control. The next comes observational, as he calls it, which is where you make the choice to go and participate in something by buying a ticket or going to the exhibit. You have no real control over what actually is shown to you or you hear, but you make the positive choice to go in and be part of that. That is the mode that most arts organizations in the past have operated in. But Alan notes that there are three others where there are, in fact, increasing levels of control. The curatorial, he suggests, is relatively new. It's where, given technology, we can now mix and collect our own collections of music, of sounds, of videos, of images. We can mix them with others online and so on. We can curate the kind of experience we want to have. We can even, in part, co-create that experience. And this is a huge area, as you all know, of explosion in the way in which people are engaging in the arts. And then even more control, if you like, over the creation or over the creative expression comes in what he calls interpretative arts participation, which is when you actually perform, when you play in that orchestra, where you dance on the stage, and so on. And then finally, of course, the inventive, which is where you create the work itself. And you yourself are the composer, the choreographer, the painter, the filmmaker. What we're seeing happening is that organizations are opening up the doorways of participation to move from one single mode to try to cover all of these modes, maybe less the ambient, but across all those others. And this is a big change for a lot of organizations. An orchestra that asks itself, well, how can we be involved with composers in our community? Or how can we have an orchestra in which people in our community get the opportunity to play? Theatres saying, how can we involve our audiences in making decisions about the structure of the program and of the work? And it's not a matter of replacing one with another, but expanding our gaze so that we actually make all our artistic decisions with a view to how we can allow these different kinds of participation. Okay, so if those are many of the changes we're seeing happen in structure, in programming, in attitudes and mindsets, what have we learned from the organizations that we've been working with in terms of how you actually practically implement an innovation project of this kind? I'm going to give you just a few lessons we've learned, and I'm going to use some more of these images that I've been using. They all come from a set called Visual Explorer, which was developed by our colleagues at the Center for Creative Leadership in Greensboro, North Carolina, and we're grateful for their permission to use them. There are a series of images that they use to help people do kind of a visual exploration of ideas rather than using literal or rational or writing-based exercises. They use the cards to stimulate visual thinking. And those of you who are here this afternoon will see them a bit more. So here are some of the things we're learning about how you actually go about implementing an innovation project. First of all, at the very outset, be really clear on the purpose of this innovation. It doesn't want to be novelty for its own sake. And you need to get the alignment around purpose at the very outset, which ensures that you're effective and efficient in the way you move forward. Secondly, don't think of innovation as being like business as usual, but just a bit different. It's actually a completely different game. It may be obvious to say that, but actually we often find that new programmatic ideas are backed by very traditional marketing or development plans that actually serve to undermine the new way of thinking. So you've got to recognize it's a completely different game that needs new thinking at every level. The third thing, and one of the most important, I think, is about team membership. You need to put together a rather special kind of team to do innovation. In our innovation lab, we insist that the organizations put together teams which we facilitate of about 10 in number, and that they include at least 2 staff members, board members, artists, and external voices, people from the community who are not associated with the organization. Only with that kind of diversity of voices, and particularly the external voices, are you going to be able to have a team that can question the status quo, that's going to be able to ask the difficult question that nobody wants to ask, and can retain an objective view of what's going on. These are remarkable teams, I will tell you, and working with them is an enormous pleasure, but they have to be carefully managed and they have to be diverse in their constitution. It's no good having a single board member on this kind of a team, because when they go back to the board and report, they can be easily dismissed. You know, it's like a UFO. If two people see it, you know, it makes it a lot better than just one. So when two board members talk about it at the board starts to say, there's something going on here. So never have a single representative of any constituency. Always have at least two, and preferably have 3 outsiders. It's really important that you have a well-composed team. We've in fact reached the conclusion that in innovation, the content, the composition, and the dynamics of the team are as important as the choice of new strategy. These two things have to go absolutely hand in hand if the innovation is going to be sustained. You want a series, you want a group of underdogs who believe they can take on the world and win. Or under penguins, I suppose. When you got this team together, it's really important that you protect it, particularly in the early days of working on an innovation. But what I mean by that is that if the team is just part of the general swim of things, they can get very easily sucked back into the culture and the everyday tasks that need to happen. They need to be protected to give them that space so they can think differently. The great scholar Warren Bennis, who's written a lot on leadership, wrote a wonderful book called Organizing Genius. He looked at great groups in different industries and how they had been formed and how they functioned. And he reached the conclusion that all these great groups had a lot of what he called island time. That's to say, time away from the mainstream of the organization. Clayton Christensen, who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, a great book about innovation, recommends that this group is almost sort of quasi-autonomous, almost like a new company within the company that exists for a while, quite separate, so that the fledgling innovation can have that opportunity to come into to be realized. Now, the other side of that is, of course, you should maintain a bridge to the mainland, because what you don't want is a group of people who get so far out ahead of where the organization is that when you report out on what you've come up with, the powers that be just reject it and say, no, no way we're doing that. So you need to have this constant communication. This may mean having the executive director be on this innovation team. It may mean those board members reporting out at every board meeting just to keep them in the swim. One way or another, you have to have a two-way bridge between the island and the mainland of your organization. You cannot reach new lands, said André Gide, without consenting to lose sight of the shore. And that's true inside organizations, but you also have to keep your eye on that shore and make sure you have a connection to it. The next thing we've learned is that the teams themselves and everybody working on innovation needs to think about how they work together in a way that's innovative. Be innovative yourselves in the way you do business. This means using lateral thinking and techniques of that kind to open up new ways of thinking about it, new ideas, and not just settling for the first thing that comes along. In these teams, you'll always find people who want to cut to the chase and say, well, so what are we going to do? And you'll find other people who want to spend forever just talking about it. Your job is to find the right middle ground that stays in the ambiguity for long enough for the really good ideas to come to the surface and for them to be converted into effective strategies. I'll do a sidebar here just to say that innovation is often confused, I think, with creativity. But creativity is an individual trait. It's a characteristic of individuals. Whereas innovation is a group activity. It's where ideas get turned into practical actions. And that requires that people work together from different perspectives to make that happen. Nonetheless, you need creative thinkers in your innovation team. They're critical, but they're not enough. They're on their own. They're not sufficient. So stay in the ambiguity. Think hard about alternative possible ways forward before you settle on the one you want to pursue. The Austrian poet Rilke had a wonderful couple of rules for writing poetry, which I always think are relevant here. He said that when you're writing a poem, when you've written the first 3 stanzas, you will have written everything you know you have it in you to say. The first rule is don't stop, because then you'll start to write the things you didn't know you had it in you to say. And the second rule is when you get to the end, throw away the first 3 stanzas. And I think that's a wonderful inspiration for innovating. Use an accelerator. In our innovation lab, we have a week-long retreat for the innovation teams in each of our organizations. And these are used to kind of telescope 6 months of those meetings into 5 days. Because there's always a point, normally 4 or 5 months into this, where the energy starts to fall away, where business as usual just overcomes us and we just don't have the energy to keep this going. And if we were to meet again every 2 weeks for 3 hours, it would just end up, we'd have no ideas, or we'd end up just doing something marginally different from business as usual. So we telescope this into 5 days so that you don't just go away the moment when the crux is arrived at and you say, oh, we'll talk about that next week. You have to sit down across the table on day 3, on day 4, on day 5, and push through. And that's why these retreats, which we call intensives for a purpose, are now described as transformative by the organizations that take part in them. At first they thought we were mad, that no one would do 5 days away with board members and outsiders and artists. Now they call them transformative, and they're really the key point. I encourage you to find a way to do an accelerator of that kind. It's worth its weight in gold. When you come back from that kind of activity, we put a huge emphasis on prototyping. That is, testing out different parts of your new strategy in relatively low-stakes environments, evaluating them to death, refining them, and then trying it again. Iterative prototyping is really crucial. We don't do this much in the arts because we don't generally have the resources to do it. But what we tend to do is someone has an idea, and when someone writes it up as a grant, we shop it out to various funders, and then lo and behold, one of them funds it, and we just do it. Actually, they generally fund about half of it, and then we still do it, right? But we don't have any of this time to actually test it and see whether it's viable before we decide about making a launch. So we find this to be really critical. It's what in the corporate sector they call stage gating. It manages the risk over time. Try things out in low-stakes environments, refine them, try them again. And one thing's worth certainly finding is that organizations that go through programs like our lab come out the other end with genuinely new strategies they've never done before, but which have nonetheless been tested and can be seen to show signs of creating public value. And that's pretty much the perfect score for a funder. That's what they're all looking for. And we're finding that funders are moving in the direction of these organizations really quite fast. When you do the prototyping, and after you come back from this accelerating intensive retreat, or whatever it is you do, it's really important to enroll others. This is probably the most important thing about getting an innovation to actually happen. It's all too easy to be on one of these teams or to have a great idea and work with your colleagues to take it halfway to reality and begin to wear a kind of halo around your head. Because you're the separate group. You're the group that goes off and does that strange thing on Fridays. You have to get beyond that halo, not by selling your new project to everybody, but by enrolling them, by finding the common interests. For a lot of people in your organizations, when something new begins to start, it's not perhaps yet implemented, but people are talking about it, a lot of resistance grows. Because this is not only something we've never done before, but it's something I don't even know how to do. So it's like a double whammy. These are legitimate concerns, and really good innovators don't think of them as coming from curmudgeonly individuals, but actually as genuine concerns that have to be considered if we're going to be able to implement this innovation in a lasting way. So really thinking about how you enroll others, how you build common interests and help everybody understand how you can all benefit from this is a critical part of the prototyping stage of working through an innovation. Those are some of the lessons we've learned. What you're going to need overall when you do this kind of work is some kind of framework which holds the work together. We early on discovered that it's not a question of needing more creative ideas in our field. It's needing frameworks to enable us to convert those ideas into practical strategies and give them legs. So we developed a number of frameworks. Here's one of them. It's for our Innovation Lab for the Performing Arts. It's a 3-part framework which you might feel you want to apply to your own work or revise to fit how you do business. The first phase, which I call research and focusing, is about thinking through lots of ideas, developing that critical innovation team, testing and discarding ideas. It's so important to funnel down from a lot of ideas in which you invest very little to a small number of ideas in which you invest a lot. We're not very good in the arts at making those decisions. We tend to be organizationally rather conflict averse because everybody's in it for the love of the arts and none of us is paid much, so how can we possibly have disagreements? We need to brush over them. But in innovating, you need to be very sharp on deciding which ideas are worth further investment, and that's really what the team has to do by gathering data and by testing ideas in the short term in phase 1. The second phase then is that accelerating intensive retreat where you really turn the corner. It's like the hinge in the program. You turn the corner and create your plan to do the prototyping. Now you become really certain what it is you want to do. And then the third phase, the longest, maybe 6 months or more, is this prototyping, where you repeatedly try out the innovation in low-stakes environments, and then you evaluate it and try it again. That itself is a way to enroll others, and a way to ensure that by the time you get to making a serious, longer-term decision, you've refined the strategy to be really effective. This is what is happening with many organizations that have been part of the lab. I'll mention just one other. The Denver Center Theater Company had an additional theater at that major complex at the center of Denver that was not used. Their project was to find a way to create what they called Not Your Grandmother's Theater in that space, to invite in and engage with young people in Denver. And they did three different prototypes in that space. They did a Wii baseball game with all the trimmings. They did a hip-hop jambalaya, where they brought in hip-hop artists to do dance with the audience, and other events of that kind that were really different. And they tested them all, and they decided on which of the aspects of what they called their recipe they would use going forward. And now they're in their first season of what they call Off-Center, at the Jones, it's called. And the board stepped up with the first 100,000, and others are now coming forward to support this new initiative that has been tested and is ready to be implemented. I hope in what I'm saying it's clear that innovation is not like lightning striking. It's actually a discipline you can learn. Some people think that organizations are kind of somehow born naturally innovative, but they're not. It's a lot of hard work, and it's a lot of careful learning that goes into making an organization highly innovative. And all of you can do that. It's a management discipline. And I believe it's the most important management discipline for the arts going forward into this new era. That conclusion was also reached by the Kellogg Foundation, which did the first big study of innovation in the nonprofit sector just a couple of years ago. It produced a report which I think is quite useful called Intentional Innovation. And it really suggested that innovation was a series of specific procedures that you and your organization could in fact become really good at. Kellogg recommended that not-for-profits should embrace innovation as a permanent part of their core competencies, part of that adaptive capacity that I've been speaking of. Because, in fact, innovation is a rational management process with its own distinct set of procedures and processes and tools. So I encourage you all to think of this not as, can we produce another idea, or can we have a flash in the pan, or should we bring in somebody who's incredibly creative just to sort something out here? But rather, as a core part of what you do as a creative organization, is bringing people together in new ways to turn ideas into practical and feasible applications, which shift the way you do business, and which change the way in which you engage your communities as participants. This is what makes innovation so incredibly exciting. And we've had so many organizations who, even at the end of a period of an innovation project, have decided not to go forward with that project, have said, we want to start again. We've learned so much. We're so excited to do this again and do it better. So organizations benefit even from what we might think of as failures. Winston Churchill famously defined failure as, defined success as moving from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. But I want to end just with a lovely poem which I think expresses some of this, because this is the real work. This is the real work our organizations, I think, have to do in this new era for the arts. And we have to get really good at this. We can't rely on business as usual anymore. We have to become highly adaptive. We have to continuously do this so it becomes part of the bones of our organization, and we have to live in the spaces of uncertainty that are part of it. Wendell Berry put it beautifully, I think, in this poem called The Real Work. He said, "It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we've begun our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings." Thank you very much.